You're listening to Inside the War Room, Case Studies in Crisis. Join us as we explore true stories and reveal new insights with our guests, key figures in some of the largest and most complex events of our time. In this episode,
So I asked the VA to determine how many of those veterans waiting for care had urgent medical problems. And they soon came back and told me the answer was 57,000 veterans had an urgent medical problem where they were waiting more than 30 days. I knew then that this was unacceptable. I knew exactly what we had to do and what the problem was. And I called for a national standout.
and now it's time to go inside the war room with your hosts, Shireen Abadi, Michael Estevez, and Jordan Strauss.
Welcome to Inside the War Room. I'm Shireen Abadi. Today I'm going to give you a little history lesson before our interview. Did you know it wasn't until the 1930s that Congress established a Department of Veterans Affairs? And it wasn't until 1989 that the department became a cabinet agency. Today, the VA is the second largest agency in the U.S. federal government, with more than 370,000 employees, second only to the DoD. In this episode, Michael interviews the 9th Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, Mr. David Shulkin. Fun fact, David had never been in government before his appointment. He's an alum and first cabinet secretary to graduate from Hampshire College, which happens to be the same alma mater as our very own co-host Jordan Strauss. David was also a physician and CEO of a health system before his public service. But you're about to hear how this once private citizen was handpicked to lead one of the government's largest agencies during a time of great crisis. Sit back and enjoy as Michael takes you inside the war room with David Shulkin.
So, Dr. Shulkin, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here.
So, Dr. Shulkin, you had a very successful career as a hospital CEO, but you've spoken about having a call to serve your country. Tell our listeners, what do you think instilled that in you?
I'd like to think I was like every other citizen. When you have the opportunity to be able to give back to a country that's given so much to you, and I was given that opportunity, I felt like I really had the obligation to go and to serve. And our country has really always relied upon the public citizen to come into government, to contribute what they could, and then to go back out in return to their normal lives. And it's been that way since the very beginning our country was formed. And, I've always felt grateful to both those who have served our country and those who continue to serve. And so I felt like I was just doing my part.
And how did the opportunity to be appointed U.S. Secretary of Veterans Affairs come about?
Well, I was a hospital CEO at the time, and I happened to be attending a conference in Washington and was invited to lunch with somebody that I didn't know. And the person I was having lunch with said to me, you've really had a great career. Do you have any regrets? And I said, not really. I feel very fortunate, but maybe one, and that is that I'm reading in the newspaper and hearing on TV about all the problems that our veterans are having right now, getting access to care. There's a wait time crisis going on, and there's allegations that veterans are actually dying because they can't get access to good health care. And I feel terrible about that and wish there was something I could do. And the person I was having lunch with just said, I can understand that. And we shook hands and said goodbye. And I started to head for home, which was actually in Philadelphia. So I got on the train from Washington to Philadelphia, and about half hour into the train ride, my cell phone rang, and I picked it up, and they said, "Is this Dr. Shulkin?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And they said, "This is the White House." And at first I thought it was a friend playing a joke on me, but it became clear to me it was the White House, and they asked whether I wouldn't mind returning to Washington to have a conversation with them about helping in fixing the situation at the VA. When President Obama nominated me, he nominated me to be Undersecretary of Health for the Department of Veteran Affairs. That is the position that actually leads the health system in the Department of Veteran Affairs, and that was in 2014 when he asked me to consider taking on that position. Um, when that happened, this was about 6 or 7 months after I had originally had a conversation with the White House that I had described earlier. And they had gone through a period of vetting where they look at all of your background and qualifications to make sure that you are not only the right person for that nomination, but that there are no issues that would get in the way of a Senate confirmation. And ultimately, when this came to a head, it turned out to be right before Christmas of 2014. In fact, I had just returned home from the hospital that I was running and had just gotten into my home where we were leaving the next morning on a family vacation. And I hadn't packed and I had a lot of things that I had to do. And just as I was starting to pack, the phone rang, the cell phone. And my wife, who's used to my phone ringing all the time, said, "Don't even think about answering it. You're on vacation now. They know that you're away. Just let it go to voicemail." And I looked at my phone and the return caller ID said 00000, 10 zeros in a row. I had never seen that. And so there was just no way I wasn't going to answer that phone. I wanted to see who would potentially be calling with that type of return caller ID. And so I picked up the phone and they said, "Dr. Shulkin, this is Air Force One. The president would like to speak to you." And that's when I learned of my nomination. The president was on his way on his family vacation to Hawaii right before Christmas and had wanted to wrap up the nomination process right before the holiday began.
How did it feel to get a phone call from the President of the United States while he's aboard Air Force One?
Well, I think that it's always an honor to speak to the president, but most importantly, I think it was trying to make sure that um, that the details of the job that was going to lie ahead were consistent with responsibilities that I felt that I could accomplish, and the last thing I wanted to do was to either let down the president, but more importantly, let down the veterans of this country. And so, to me, it was more about the content than essentially the content of the conversation, rather than the formality of being asked to serve as a presidential appointee.
Now, the Department of Veterans Affairs is well known by all, but a lot of people may not fully appreciate the scope of it all. Can you talk a little bit about its mission, how it's structured, how many people it employs?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's most important to understand the purpose of the Department of Veteran Affairs. It's really to help serve and honor the country's responsibility to those who have sacrificed for the country. So that represents about 20 million American veterans today. The Department of Veteran Affairs is the second largest government agency. The first largest is the Department of Defense, but then follows the Department of Veteran Affairs, which has a budget each year of about $210 billion. It employs over 400,000 people, and it has facilities in almost every part of the country and even in different parts of the world, really wherever veterans happen to live and need to have their services. That's where the Department of Veteran Affairs needs to be. It's organized into three different agencies: the health of taking care of our veterans, and that really is running hospitals and clinics and employing doctors and nurses. There is a administration that takes care of the benefits for veterans: disability payments, educational benefits, home loans, things that have been very important to veterans throughout the past number of decades. And then the third administration is the cemeteries. The VA runs a series of national cemeteries throughout the country in order to give veterans the type of final send-off that many of them choose to have, that honors them with dignity and respect all the way through the end of their life.
Now, during your tenure at the VA, you dealt with a lot of issues, but the one I think is most prominent, or amongst the issues that were most prominent, was the national wait time issue. For people who may not recall the specifics, can you describe the nature of the national wait time issue?
Yeah, the wait time issue turned out to be a national crisis that started in 2014, in April of 2014, and became quickly a national headline where the allegations that were brought to Congress were that veterans were unable to get appointments to see doctors, often with conditions like cancer, and ultimately we're just left to struggle through these issues without really the proper medical care. And of course, when that became public, people were outraged, and it led to not only congressional investigations, but the resignation of the Secretary of the Department of Veteran Affairs, the resignation of the Undersecretary of Veteran Affairs, which led the healthcare system, and many, many other government officials, including criminal investigations that were undertaken. So it really put the Department of Veteran Affairs under a microscope, and the administration, because the American people felt that veterans deserved a lot better treatment than what they were getting.
How did you go about setting the priorities to solve the national wait time problem? What obstacles did you confront? How did you solve them?
Well, first of all, let's just go back to the timeline. So the national wait time crisis becomes public in April of 2014, leading to the resignations of the secretary and the undersecretary. I do not get confirmed by the US Senate until July of 2015. So we're talking about a period now of 15 months later after the crisis. During that time, the Department of Veteran Affairs had no Senate confirmed leader of its health system. So I entered the administration really 15 months into this crisis, and I was very surprised to come in and to see that there was not a coherent plan to fix this problem. So I immediately determined that any period of assessing the situation, any period of taking time to study it, was not going to be appropriate. That even though I had never served in government, I had never really worked in the Department of Veteran Affairs, except for when I was a medical student resident many, many years ago. I just didn't have the time to study the problem the way that you normally would when you take on a new job, because veterans' lives were at risk. So the very first thing that I did was I asked the question, how many veterans were waiting for care? And the way that the VA measured this was they would measure how many veterans were waiting more than 30 days for an appointment. And the answer came back, there were 555,000 veterans waiting more than 30 days to get an appointment. And when I heard that, frankly, even though that's a big number, this is a very, very big system, I didn't know if that was a good number or a bad number. And I asked the staff that was working with me at the time whether that was a good number or a bad number. And frankly, they didn't know how to answer that. And I said, the only way that I know how to answer that is to determine how many of those veterans needed to be seen right away. In other words, how many had urgent medical problems? If you had chest pain or you had a nodule in your lung that you didn't know if it was cancer or not, you can't wait. So waiting more than 30 days would be absolutely a terrible thing. But if you were going to have a routine physical exam or a routine scheduled colonoscopy, waiting more than 30 days, frankly, is not unusual in the private sector either. So I asked the VA to determine how many of those veterans waiting for care had urgent medical problems. And they soon came back and told me the answer was 57,000 veterans had an urgent medical problem that was uh, that where they were waiting more than 30 days. I knew then that this was unacceptable. I knew exactly what we had to do and what the problem was, and I called for a national stand down. What a stand down is, it's a military term where you stop whatever you're doing and you focus on a single objective. I wanted everybody to stop what they were doing throughout the VA system and focus on getting those 57,000 veterans with the urgent problems to be seen. And this was very early on, where I called for this national stand down over a weekend. And by Monday morning, after the national stand down, we had less than 1,000 veterans throughout the country who did not have their urgent medical problems taken care of and evaluated. And those 1,000 were people that we weren't able to reach, or that chose not to come back to the VA, even though we had reached them. And so I knew that by getting the attention of the VA, by prioritizing these urgent medical problems, really in a weekend, we were able to solve this issue. The problem then became that I knew from my past management experience that if you solve a problem, over time, those problems tend to recur. If you don't fix the systemic issue, if you don't change the system, ultimately we would climb back up to have another national wait time crisis at some point. So I had to change the system, and the only way that I knew how to assure that this would never happen again would be to put in a system of same day appointments. That means if a veteran has an urgent medical issue or a mental health issue, they should be able to be seen that same day for the issue. That way I knew that there would never be a buildup of veterans with urgent medical issues. So I declared that as our objective. And by December of 2016, as the Obama administration was coming to an end, I was able to tell President Obama that every VA medical center across the country had in place same day appointments for urgent medical problems for both physical and mental health issues. And to this day, that's the commitment of the VA, to have same day services available at every VA medical center.
So your approach was solve the problem, fix the system. That's pretty good advice for a lot of leaders.
Yeah. And there's a third component that's important to do. That is to put in a way to monitor and ensure that the integrity of the system is going to be in place. And the only way that I knew how to do that was to use transparency. And by transparency, I meant that in order to assure veterans and their families and the American public that we were going to see veterans when they needed to be seen, and that we would not tolerate another wait time crisis, I knew that I needed to publish and publicly post our wait times for every VA medical center across the country. And so I announced that we would be the first healthcare system, and frankly, the only healthcare system that I'm aware of, that publishes and posts its wait times on a real-time basis, so that anybody can see by going to the internet exactly what the wait times are at the VA that they are choosing to get their care at. And so with that in place, I felt confident that this would be a problem that would be resolved and continue to function the way that it should for our veterans.
That level of transparency would make a lot of leaders uneasy because you're establishing a public standard for yourself that you might not meet. What would you say to people that would be concerned about taking on that level of commitment to be that transparent?
Well, certainly transparency has its risks, but I believe that um, having worked in healthcare as long as I have, that people tend to fix problems for the short term. And if you don't take the bold steps to make sure that you thought this through for a long-term solution, you simply resolve the problem over and over again. And I was not going to see that happen in the Department of Veteran Affairs. And so I wanted to make sure that we put in a long-lasting solution. But as you said, that level of risk of publishing and being transparent means that you're exposing yourself to not only the good things that you've done, but certainly where there's problems. And when you're talking about a system as large as the Department of Veteran Affairs healthcare system, the largest healthcare system in our country, you're going to have problem areas. You're going to have areas where the doctor retired or is sick, and all of a sudden you're going to have wait time issues. And so while I had worked with the team to develop the system so that we could post this information, when I told the Obama administration that I wanted to go ahead and do this, they did not allow me to post this information. They considered the fact that this information might be used to embarrass the Department of Veteran Affairs. It may lead to newspaper articles, or it may lead to congressional investigations in those parts of the country where the wait times were not good. And they did not want me to do it. I was extremely disappointed. When I got the opportunity to become the secretary, and I went to President Trump and I told him that I felt that this was important to do and that I needed to do this, he gave me his approval to do it, and we were able to publish it literally within hours. And I do believe that that was the right decision, and I believe it's an important reason why the Department of Veteran Affairs has maintained better wait times than the private sector. And I should say that when I left the Department of Veterans, I was involved in research that published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a comparison of wait times at the VA to wait times in the private sector, where most people get their care. And the Department of Veteran Affairs is now better than the private sector, significantly better, shorter wait times. I would say that there were two other key decisions that I made along the way. Number one is that I really doubled down on the VA's ability to use telehealth. The VA had a mandate to be able to provide care to veterans wherever they lived. And that meant that we were providing care to veterans in rural parts of the country where we didn't have medical facilities, where people lived in very isolated areas of the country, like in Alaska, but it was our responsibility to provide them care. And so one of the things that I did was I dramatically expanded our ability to use technology and telehealth to deliver that care. And I think that that was very effective. And it turned out to be very important during the COVID-19 crisis for the VA to be able to deliver care to its veterans. It had that infrastructure in place because we had built it, and they were able to use that in a similar way when they couldn't have people coming into the medical centers. The second issue that I made a decision on, which turned out to be fairly controversial, but I believe the right decision, was I granted nurses, advanced practice nurses, independent practice authority. And that means that I used the federal supremacy laws to go above the state laws, and I granted nurse practitioners the ability to practice without having the supervision of a physician. And that gave us the ability to put nurse practitioners and to utilize them in areas of the country where we didn't have physicians and where the wait times were the longest and we had recruitment problems. And that helped significantly in providing care to veterans that were unable to get care previously. And I believe it provided high quality care to them.
In addition to the national wait time issue, you had many other issues that you had to address, one of which is veteran suicide. It's fairly well documented that the suicide rate amongst veterans is high. Can you talk about the scope of the issue nationally, and what are some of the things that you worked to implement while you held your appointment?
Yeah, the issue of suicide as a public health issue is a significant one across the country. We're seeing a dramatic rise in suicide among young adults. Um, but the problem in veterans is even more significant. The rate of among veterans is almost double that of the general American public. And we're seeing 20 veterans a day taking their own life, which is just a staggering number. That's thousands each year. And it was something that one of the most difficult things that I had to do was to meet with parents and wives and children of veterans who had come back and clearly having uh, suffered from the invisible wounds of war, these, post-traumatic stress and other types of mental health issues, and not getting the proper care and resulting in taking their own lives. So I made this the single top clinical priority of the Department of Veteran Affairs and wanted to make sure that we did everything possible to begin to start addressing this very, very complex and tough problem. And I think that we made a lot of progress, but certainly nowhere near being able to say that we had found all the solutions that we needed or that the job was done. That this is a very tough issue, but improving access to mental health is part of it. But finding the right treatments and therapies and being able to work across communities to be able to get everybody aware of this problem, I think was part of it. So, of the 20 veterans that take their life every day, only 6 of those veterans are actually getting care in the VA. That means that the majority of veterans, or 14 of those each day, are actually out in the community somewhere. And my fear, of course, is that they're not getting any care at all. So part of what we had to do was to establish a national effort to work with local governments, to work with state governments, to work with community organizations, churches, veterans groups, to all begin to identify veterans who are at risk and provide them with opportunities to get the type of care that they needed. And that is still an ongoing effort and something that is still prioritized by the Department of Veteran Affairs because it's not job done. It's still very much in progress.
So that seems like a near insurmountable issue. And leaders in business and government confront similarly difficult issues. What advice would you give to leaders in business and government who are confronting large scale issues like that? No evident solution is on the horizon, but it's so important that you got to keep at it. Like, what advice would you give them?
Well, I don't think leaders run away from hard problems. So I think that the first step is that you have to acknowledge the problem, acknowledge the difficulty, and you have to make a public commitment that you're going to stick at this and that you're going to work to find ways to improve the situation, even if it's not clear at the time what those solutions are. And once you do that, you free up the people that you work with and the people in your organization to be able to start talking about it and finding solutions and generating ideas and testing ideas. And I think that's the way that you begin to do this. I think what people and organizations look for is whether you're going to stick at it, whether you're going to consistently be talking about the message and being honest about the progress or the lack of progress in solving the problem. So, consistency of messaging, honesty and transparency in the problem, and celebrating success where you have it and acknowledging failure where you have it as well, I think are important components of addressing any complex issue.
Now, beneath the surface of all of the issues that we've been talking about, there was another issue related to the infrastructure within the VA. Can you talk about the state of affairs related to infrastructure when you arrived? Can you help our listeners understand the situation and What were some of the things you tried to do to bring the infrastructure into the modern age?
Yeah, I came from the position that I felt that our veterans deserve the very best healthcare that this country can offer. And that means having a modernized system of tools, technology, facilities, and best practices that we knew that we could take from the private sector. Uh, I came to actually have a different understanding of the situation once I entered the VA. And one of the ways that I've always continued to learn as an executive, particularly leading a healthcare organization, is I would put on my white coat and my stethoscope, and I would go and take care of veterans um, just like any other doctor would. And so when I wore my white coat, I was the doctor, I wasn't the secretary. And that gave me a good understanding of exactly what it felt like to get care in the VA, what it was like for the staff to work with the tools and the systems that they had and to work in the facilities that they had. And I used that information to be able to help improve. So, one of the decisions that I made after working in the VA using the electronic health record, which was a homegrown system in the VA, was to move us away from the homegrown system to a commercial system. And I did that for a number of reasons, but largely because I felt that in order for the VA to stay updated and to be able to modernize its system, it needed to have access to the best technologies. And that the homegrown system, while it was a very good system, and I found it a good system to use as a physician, it did not have the opportunity to be able to keep up with what was happening with the rapid advances in technology. Um, in a similar way, I felt that many of our facilities, which had been built in the 1950s and 60s, had become outdated, and we needed to find new ways to be able to keep up with having the best facilities for our veterans. So we started to do this in a different way. We started to partner with the private sector. And I'm very pleased that in Omaha, Nebraska, we just opened up a brand new facility, about as modern and nice as you can imagine, that was done in combination with the private sector. So it was done with many, many fewer dollars from the taxpayers. It was done in record time, and it was built to standards that, frankly, the old federal standards, if we had done it alone, wouldn't have allowed us to do. So, a large part of what I was trying to do was to bring modern approaches into the VA with the goal of having a world class modern healthcare system.
During your tenure, there were other crises to which you needed to respond, one of which was the Pulse nightclub mass shooting in Florida. Tell our listeners about what happened and how you responded.
Again, I recall this as a weekend where I happened to be at home and I was watching the national news, and the news came out about the horrific killing of, you know, dozens and dozens of innocent people in Orlando, Florida, at the Pulse nightclub. And the feeling, as most people watching, not only of being horrified, but of feeling, boy, I wish there was something that I could do. And so here I was, at that time, the undersecretary of the VA, but running the healthcare system, knowing that VA had the largest number of grief counselors, of psychologists, of mental health professionals. It had mobile units that it practiced for emergencies. And I felt like if anybody could help respond to this national crisis that was happening as we were watching it, it would be the VA. So I got on the phone and I called our emergency command centers that were in the southern part of the United States near Orlando. And I said, I want to dispatch our mobile emergency units. I want to dispatch our psychologists and our grief counselors and anybody else who can help with this. And the response that I got back was that the lawyers at the VA had decided that I could not do that, that the legislation that Congress had given was that these resources were for veterans, and I could not be assured that there were veterans involved in this at the Orlando nightclub. And in fact, I did not interpret what the lawyers said as correct. Under Title 38, that I did have the authority for the VA to respond to national emergencies outside of the scope of veterans, that was in my authority. But regardless of that, I felt it was the right thing to do, that if we had the ability to help, just like I would pull over if I'm driving a car and I saw an accident and I'm a physician, I pull over because I believe I can help and I believe it's the right thing to do. And so I overruled the lawyers and I said, I am giving explicit instructions to dispatch those mobile units and get our staff down there. And our staff over the next couple of days after that horrific shooting helped 5,500 people and their families get through that crisis. And I know by talking to the staff how good they felt about having the ability to help and to contribute during that very, very tough period of time in Orlando. Many people criticized me. And in fact, there were people who felt that I had overstepped my authority and that I should be held accountable for that. I felt that as a leader, that if I hadn't have made that decision, that would be a abdication of my responsibility, and I was willing to be held accountable. If that was the last day that I was going to serve in government because people felt that I made the wrong decision, I was prepared to accept that as a consequence. In fact, that not only did not happen, but President Obama specifically called out the VA and acknowledged us and thanked us for what we did to help respond to the Pulse nightclub shooting. And I made sure to use that example as a teaching point for our leadership team at the VA, where I explicitly talked about this as an example and talked about it as principle-based leadership, that if you're leading an organization that is there to help people and you have the capabilities, even if there is potential risk involved, including risk of your own job, that what principle-based leaders do is they stand up and they make those types of hard decisions, and they're willing to be held accountable for those decisions. And hopefully that became a teaching lesson for other leaders in the Department of Veteran Affairs.
Now, that's not the only time you've taken a principled stand on issues. Now, in 2017, white supremacists marched on Charlottesville, Virginia, and President Trump's response at the time was quite controversial, at least the way it was reported in the news media. You on your own boldly spoke out on this issue, not to contradict the president, but it was an independent statement that you made that garnered a lot of attention. What advice would you give to leaders in that vein as well, to speak out on things that might not necessarily be aligned with the views of others?
Well, I believe that if you have convictions and you believe something is important, that staying silent is probably the most dangerous path to take. And if you study history, it's where people stayed silent, even when they saw the wrongs beginning to happen, that situations get out of control. And for me, I happened to be with President Trump when the Charlottesville issue was rolling out before the country. We were at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, for a signing of a bill that would give veterans additional educational options. The new GI Bill is what we called it. And the president had just finished playing golf, and drove up to me as I was in the driveway in his golf cart and said, "Hey, do you hear what's going on at Charlottesville?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, all I've heard is the news reports, but I don't have any additional information than that." And then we spent the next couple hours together, and I heard his comments. And of course, I felt I had the choice of staying silent on the situation. Earlier that morning, I had spent time at a local VA in New Jersey where I met a 94-year-old veteran who had actually been fighting the Nazis. And I began to reflect upon what that generation of our veterans had done. They'd put their lives on the line to make sure that the Nazi ideology and the Nazi actions never could take hold in this country, and certainly protected those over in Europe as well. And here we were on that very day facing Nazis and neo-Nazis and white supremacists marching in Charlottesville. So I decided I could not stay silent. And I went to the national press and simply said, "Look, I'm going to speak on behalf of myself as a citizen, but as a member of the cabinet. And this is something that we should not be staying silent on. We have to make sure that we do not allow the neo-Nazis and white supremacists to go unchallenged. That is not what this country is about. It's not what our veterans fought for and continue to fight for. And this is not an American value. And we have to speak out against this." And I thought, and I had prepared my family. I said, "Once I do this, please be prepared. This may be my last day serving in government. The president may not like this and may fire me. And if that happens, I can live with that. What I can't live with is staying silent on this issue." And it was nationally publicized, and for whatever reason, I wasn't fired that day. But it was something that I felt it was important for me to have done.
Principled leadership is not always admired by everyone. Now, during your tenure, you had to deal with leaks to news media, tough questions that were likely planted by adversaries and people opposed to what it was you were trying to accomplish. What advice would you give to leaders when it comes to dealing with leaks or hostile questions from journalists, that come from either the mainstream news media or social media that could potentially be disruptive to your strategic agenda?
Well, it turns out the hard part of my job in Washington was really not dealing with the substance of the issues, whether it was wait times or suicide or modernizing the VA. It turned out the really hard part of the job was dealing with the politics. And uh, I had a situation where I was the only member of the Trump cabinet that had come from the Obama administration. That didn't make a number of people in the Trump camp happy. They thought that I was not a member of their team and that I was a member of the Obama team. And so they worked to essentially try to get rid of me right from day one. The truth was that I was not on the Obama team. I was not on the Trump team. I was only on the veterans team. I didn't come to Washington to play partisan politics or to participate in this. I wasn't running for elected office. I simply wanted to do my part in being able to help make this system work better for our veterans. And unfortunately, in Washington, when you don't declare your allegiance, when you're not part of one of the political spectrums, so you're more in the center. It's a tough place to be. I was the only member of the cabinet to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate 100-0. I just didn't do politics. I didn't do partisanship. And ultimately, that turned out to be a tough place to be in the Trump administration, where political appointees saw that as a problem, that I wasn't willing to declare political loyalty, and therefore tried to get rid of me. And the way that they did that was they would leak stories to the press that frankly were allegations that were false, but constantly I found myself having to be in the position of defending all these crazy and false allegations. Uh, and the only way that I knew how to respond to that was through transparency. I made myself completely available to the press, would respond to questions. In Washington, when you do that, that gives more airtime to your issues. It gives your enemies more ability to be able to keep stories going. And unfortunately, in the environment that we're in today, those that frankly say no comment and don't talk to the press ultimately turn out maybe to be better in terms of protecting their own jobs and in staying out of the limelight. But as I've mentioned several times, I didn't come to Washington to play games. I didn't come to create a political career. I came to focus on the principles I believed in and trying to improve the situation for our veterans. And so, therefore, the only way I knew how to respond was to be open, transparent. And I felt as a public official that I had the responsibility to respond to the press, not to hide from the press. But, I think that there are many reasonable ways to deal with the situation in Washington as it exists today. And I'm not sure that um, that since my objective was not to remain there at all costs, I dealt with it the way that I personally felt most comfortable with.
Dr. Shulkin, are there any key points or any last pieces of advice that you would like to give our listeners?
Well, I do think that that I want to make sure that people understand that having the ability to serve your country and to do public service is a great honor and privilege. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And I think this is true of every leadership position, that when you are the leader of an organization, you have certain responsibilities that sometimes are going to be very challenging. And it's always important to go back to um, behaving in a way that are consistent with your values and principles, and making sure people understand why you make those decisions. So ultimately, when I left government, which was by a presidential tweet, um, I could have stayed quiet about that. The unwritten rule in Washington is when your time has come, you should go quietly. But I didn't sign up for that. I didn't agree to any rule. I only agreed to the principle of I was there to help our country's veterans. So right after that presidential tweet, which happened in the evening on March 28th of 2018, I ended up sitting down at my computer and penning an editorial to the New York Times that was published before midnight that night, that basically said, the reason why I am writing this is because I am concerned that this administration is going to privatize the VA. And I explained why I believe that I was fired. And I explained the reason why I felt it was a bad idea to allow the VA to be privatized. And I think that level of transparency and sunlight that was put on that issue really helped Congress do its job of oversight to make sure that that didn't happen to the VA, that didn't happen to the country. So I felt that I was continuing to honor the principles I believed in even after I left the VA, to make sure that the right things were being done for our veterans. And I continue to this day to advocate for those positions. I speak out on behalf of veterans who have had burn pit exposures and aren't getting the help that they want. I've continued to speak out on behalf of our veterans from Vietnam who were exposed to Agent Orange and are not getting the benefits that they deserve. And I'll continue to speak out wherever I can for as long as I live, to be able to help do the right thing for our veterans, regardless of the politics. And I think it's important that people in leadership positions adhere to the principles that they believe in.
And one final question, taking it squarely into the domain of crisis management. What final pieces of advice would you give to leaders in business and government on how to competently and transparently manage a crisis?
I think first gather all the information and make sure you as a leader are getting the true story. And once you have all the information that you believe that you're going to be able to get at that time, think through ultimately what the right answer is. And too many leaders try interim steps in crisis management, and the story continues to unfold, usually not in a positive way. But think about the end game. What got you into that problem? What needs to happen? And what's the right thing and outcome of that crisis? And jump right to that answer and face it head on, even if it's difficult times. I believe that a crisis needs a quick and rapid response. And often that may not seem like the easiest answer, but it's not about what is the easiest answer. It's about what is the right answer to respond to that crisis.
Outstanding. Dr. Shulkin, we appreciate you joining us inside the War Room, and we thank you for your views.
Thank you.
When you're living your job 24/7 and the measure of devotion to your country is almost complete, crisis can be unusually personal. Now, I say this as a DOJ alum, but especially at the VA. Public servants work harder and are usually paid less than their private sector counterparts. They care deeply, often personally, about the mission and its success. One of the most important parts of managing a crisis is figuring out how to think about it holistically. Is there an opportunity masquerading as a problem? Has a certain way of thinking dominated such that the problem and its solution are amorphous? Have you defined success, or are you just managing the problem and not managing the crisis? Sometimes, whether you've been at something for a while or just walked into something new, taking a moment, a sort of collective deep breath can be helpful. Dr. Shulkin did that with his department-wide stand down, and he got great results.
Dr. Shulkin gave a masterclass in how to immediately respond to a crisis when there's little time to study the problem and action is needed immediately. Ask simple, direct questions to understand the nature of the issue and define a targeted outcome. Specifically, you heard Dr. Shulkin talk about the very direct questions he asked at the outset. How many veterans were waiting more than 30 days to get an appointment? Is that a good number or a bad number? How many veterans waiting had urgent medical needs? Then he defined a targeted outcome. He called for a national stand down to focus on getting those 57,000 veterans with urgent medical needs seen. And within a matter of days, the committed people across the Veterans Health Administration had solved that first and most pressing challenge. But there's another important topic that Dr. Shulkin briefly discussed regarding his interactions with the news media. Specifically, something many senior leaders worry about, which is the anonymous leak. The best advice in this case is do not fear the media leak, plan for it. No matter the situation, whether it's a potential business acquisition, a lawsuit containing explosive allegations, or an inquiry from a regulatory agency, one of the first documents your communications team should prepare is a leak strategy. Decide in advance what you'll say in case you receive an inquiry from a journalist who clearly has the pertinent details of the situation, and also decide what you'll do if you see an accurate and detailed social media post online. Your leak strategy should not only account for how you'll communicate publicly, but it should also factor in legal and operational considerations as well. There are many insights from Dr. Shulkin that we could discuss, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode. We'd like to thank Dr. Shulkin again for sharing his views, and we'll see you again next time inside the War Room.
You've been listening to Inside the War Room, Case Studies in Crisis. Inside the War Room is produced by global communications firm BCW and global investigations firm Kroll, a division of Duff & Phelps. For more information about this episode, and to learn more about how you can work with BCW and Kroll to prepare, respond, and recover from a crisis affecting your organization, visit our website at itwrpodcast.com.